Thank you. My name is John Charles, president of Cascade Policy Institute in Portland, Oregon. And for those of you who don't happen to have your handy-dandy little bios of the speakers, I should probably take 30 seconds to tell you something about myself, because this is a sort of a conference of contrarians, and I have been a contrarian for a while, although I didn't intend to do that. It's odd that I'm even in my job, because I started my professional career 30 years ago working for the Environmental Defense Fund here in their New York office, a group now known as Environmental Defense, but they were then and still are one of the gang of 10 big environmental groups. In 1980, I was hired to run the Oregon Environmental Council out in Portland, Oregon, and so I packed up and just moved across the country and spent almost 17 years running Oregon's most well-known environmental lobby organization, where I worked for and against thousands of pieces of legislation and helped pass some of the environmental laws in Oregon. So I spent 20 years living in the belly of the regulatory beast, so to speak, before becoming pretty disillusioned with that in the mid-1990s, and with the help of people like Bob Poole and Reason Magazine and Terry Anderson and the PERC folks, decided to just walk away from all of that, quit my job with no plan in mind, which my parents thought was a pretty stupid thing to do in middle age. And was fortunate enough to be hired by Cascade Policy Institute, a free market think tank in Portland, Oregon, to become an environmental analyst for them. And now I'm president 12 years later. I've sort of been forced to become knowledgeable about climate change, at least as a non-technical person, because Portland's status, wanting to be a leader in this, engaging in sort of a competitive race to the bottom with other left-wing jurisdictions like Berkeley and San Francisco and Boulder, is to see how many punitive, wealth-destroying regulations they can impose on their citizens, so they can brag about it at conferences when they go to. Portland in 1993 became, at least they proclaimed this, the first city in America to adopt a global warming policy, so they were ahead of the curve. And they adopted a long list of government and private sector activities and mandates, which including requiring all city and county construction projects to exceed the energy code on new construction, a mandate on local retail gasoline dealers to sell a minimum level of biodiesel and ethanol fuels, commitment to a huge rail transit network and subsidized transit-oriented development projects, which has squandered billions of dollars that could have been more productively spent elsewhere, and roughly 50 other actions mandated by this plan. Now, most recently, the proposal pending before the City Council is to impose a carbon tax on all new construction in the city, public or private, if it does not exceed existing energy codes by more than 30%, and then to bribe them with a subsidy if it exceeds by 40%, which is kind of an interesting comment on the rule of law, that if you just merely comply with the building code, you get a penalty, which makes me wonder, well, maybe they'll change the traffic code so that if you merely stop at the stop sign, you'll get fined because you didn't go beyond stop. I'm not sure what's next. Furthermore, they didn't announce this in Portland. They announced, the mayor and the city council member announced it at a Greenbelt conference in Chicago, where there were probably 1,000 attendees of these green design people. And the Portland folks were treated like rock stars, because this was going to be the next wealth-destroying policy they were going to impose on Portland. So they didn't bother to announce it in Portland. So that's what we're up against in Portland. And as a result, we've lost the ability to have a rational conversation about this. And although I'm very impressed with all the technical people here today, and I've enjoyed the technical presentations, in Portland we deal in symbols and religious icons, which is the problem. That's why this is a seminar on politics. Well, the fact that this is the case, it actually causes bureaucrats to sort of get in the habit of being dishonest, because the end justifies the means as far as they're concerned. And this came to light especially in June of 2005, when Portland's Office of Sustainable Development released a report announcing that the 2004 emissions of CO2 within Multnomah County were lower than the emissions of the county in 1990. And since that's the magic benchmark for the Kyoto Protocol, and according to the report's authors, this is an achievement, quote, likely unequaled in any other major U.S. city. So they were pretty happy about that. Now, Jane Lubchenco, a prominent professor at Oregon State University, past president of AAAS, receiver of multiple green awards, she upped the ante a few days later by proclaiming to the Oregonian, "Well, I know of no other city in the world that has lowered greenhouse gas emissions to this level." This caught the attention of New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, who published a piece in July exalting Portland as America's environmental laboratory for having, quote, achieved stunning reductions in carbon emissions while booming economically. Kristof concluded that by implying that if George Bush read Portland's global warming progress report, his decision on how to deal with global warming would be a no-brainer. As it turns out, this was an apt description of the analytical effort most of these commentators put into reviewing the Portland CO2 report, because the big reductions actually never happened. This was admitted by the Sustainable Development Office after a number of inquiries by us, in which they admitted they had this little math error. They were off by 74,000 tons, which was just enough to put them under the 1990 levels. So the corrected totals did not really make Portland Kyoto compliant, but by that time, the story had already been published. The New York Times had called them a great environmental laboratory, and they didn't really need to worry about this anymore, and so it never became news. But actually, we had a much more significant problem with the report, which was that they claimed it was based, what was driving the Portland progress was our transportation-related emissions from 1990 to 2004 had gone down, and transportation is the big emitter. Now, to reach this conclusion, the Office of Sustainable Development estimated transportation emissions not on the basis of actually some kind of measurement of driving, but by the sale of gasoline in Multnomah County, which includes Portland. However, the software manual for the software program they were using cautioned them that, quote, these records, gasoline sales, do not take into consideration fuel purchased outside the community and consumed within the community boundaries, which would seem to be a pretty evident problem. And all the relevant data indicate this is exactly what has happened. For example, the total number of motor vehicles registered in Multnomah County rose by 45% from 1990 to 2004. And total travel on state-owned highways within the county increased by 11%. So one would imagine that if this was all going on, the actual CO2 from driving was also going up and not down. Well, here it is more than 2 years later, and the Portland's city website continues to publish the same report using the same flawed methodology. So by their line of thinking, if every gasoline dealer in Multnomah County relocated to another county tomorrow, the city could issue a press release and claim that it had become the first city in the world to eliminate all transportation-related CO2 emissions because they sold no gasoline in the county, even though you could look out the window of any building and see hundreds of thousands of cars going by. Now, one would think they would be embarrassed by using gasoline sales in the county as a surrogate for CO2 from transportation. But you can't really shame them on this. Now, what else are we doing to comply? Well, our city council has a goal of purchasing all municipal electricity needs from renewable energy by 2010, even though this would require massive taxpayer subsidies. And they enacted this in 2001. 2010 is not too far away. And right now, they're up to 2% purchase of green power, so they only have 98% to go by 2010. Plus, they've already spent more than $250,000 on consultants to try and advise them how they would do this, including they considered for a while becoming an equity investor in a wind farm, and then they backed away from that. And so if this was actually a sustainable idea, it's something that you could be easily replicated elsewhere in the economy, or should be replicated. But how many individual taxpayers have $250,000 to spend on consultants to advise them to how to actually do this? So even if they somehow figure it out in 2 years, it's really not going to be replicable. Well, I want to wind down by telling you one kind of last feature story of how ridiculous this has gotten in Portland. In 1997, Oregon passed the nation's first law regulating CO2 from new electrical generating facilities. The emission rate is 17% below the cleanest known facility in the country and will be periodically adjusted to continue to be 17%, so that you can't ever actually comply, and a plant developer essentially has to choose to make it's an extortion scheme. You make a one-time lump sum payment of funds to this thing called the Oregon Climate Trust that was created right afterwards to offset the emission of CO2 emissions over the life of the power plant. And then in turn, the trust must use the funds to carry out projects that avoid, sequester, or displace the CO2 that the plant will emit in excess of the required arbitrary standard. So in its first 2 years, the trust received more than $6 million in revenue, and one of the projects its sponsor was an internet-based carpool program run by the city of Portland. The trust ranked this program very high for its potential to reduce single-occupant driving. But after the first year of implementation, so few people had signed up that each new carpool formed had cost electricity ratepayers approximately $29,000 per carpool. And the Portland Tribune picked up on this and had a big headline, and the bureaucrats at the city of Portland didn't like it very much. And they said, but that's only after 1 year. After this gets going, it'll work. Well, the trouble is, I followed this, and the other problem is that the city of Portland was required to submit reports to the Climate Trust because they'd received quite a bit of money and they had a contractual obligation to find these offsets, so they had to submit reports. And when I read the reports every year, and getting them out of the city was like pulling teeth, but the carpool program measured poorly even when going against its own benchmarks. In 2002, the emissions target for the program was 2,000 tons of CO2 offsets. The estimated actual offsets were 95 tons, only 5% of the goal. Well, in 2003, the target was 4,500 tons, but the actual offsets were 756, or 17% of the goal. In 03 and 04, the target was higher, it was 7,500 tons, but the actual estimated was 19% of the goal. So after 3 years, it was completely flaming out. They hadn't figured out yet that over time, almost everywhere in the country, carpooling is declining, and no matter how much you have websites to advertise and how much you try and induce people to give up the privacy of their car to carpool with others, people's preferences just tend to be that they don't want to do that. Well, we have recently been following up on this, trying to nail it down as a case study. And I want to share some email with one of the bureaucrats from OSD, which I only got in the last week. It's pretty entertaining. Because it gives you insights into the bureaucratic mind of these left-wing cities like Portland. This gentleman says, well, he's from the Climate Trust. Like all of our projects, Carpool Match Northwest was selected based on a strong additionality case. This would be additional CO2 offsets, the ability to monitor and verify emissions reductions, and perceived risks to the project's success. Disappointingly, this project did not meet its performance goals, generating only 3,075 metric tons of greenhouse gas offsets. 5 years after the project was implemented, the City of Portland and the Climate Trust agreed to exercise a contractual provision which allowed the city to provide replacement offsets in the event that the project did not meet its minimum performance goals. So that was their escape hatch. Well, the city provided, well, it sounds like it's the escape hatch, but here's what actually happened. They're telling me, this is a direct quote, the city provided replacement offsets from 2 transportation projects, the East Side Hub project, 20,000 metric tons, and the Travel Smart Interstate project for another 4,000. Both projects utilized individualized marketing strategies to reduce vehicle trips and promote alternative modes of transportation. Sounds sort of like what they had just failed doing with promoting carpooling. While both are excellent projects, the Climate Trust did not attempt to quantify their results. Okay, by providing the replacement tons, the City of Portland has met its contractual obligations to the Climate Trust. So first you extort money from a utility when they build, you spend the money, you admit it didn't work, you get another backup project, but you don't quantify whether that worked, but you call it good. So they say, though this project did not perform to expectations, it did benefit both the Climate Trust and the City of Portland, and both parties learned a great deal from the experience. The results highlight the difficulties of measuring these types of projects and underscore the importance of accurately gauging project risk during the assessment phase. In the long run, the lessons from this project have enabled the City of Portland to become a leader in sustainability and in measurement technology for vehicle trip reduction programs. Well, they claim they've learned, but that program has now been transferred to our regional entity called Metro, and more public money has been dumped in, so they're charging ahead. They're still not quantifying anything. And it just, my time is up, so I'll just kind of leave you with the three little points from this, which is that basically, on this issue, there has been no learning by politicians and bureaucrats, and largely because, well, there's no penalties for being wrong. It's not their money they're playing with. It's just someone else's money. And to admit that you're wrong, well, that's painful. So it's better to just keep dumping public money and wasting it. So really, as much as I admire the technical presentations here, you know, this has become a cult, and we deal in symbols. And in order to move ahead to rational discussion, those of us who are skeptical of this are going to have to come up with our own sort of symbols to get people to understand that, especially with coercive taxation, income redistribution schemes, this is going to be all pain, no gain. Thank you.